Well, good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to see you all. We had a great class last week. I just loved it, and I really appreciate your avid listening. I just so appreciate it. Thank you. And your good questions. So I did want to show you, this is the book that my presentation is based on. Jean bought it and is finding it helpful. But this is Marcus Borg, who is one of the preeminent scholars of the day. And I just really recommend anything he's written is worth reading. So that everything here is based on this and other studies.
That's bigger.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Practical matter.
How did you all do with your homework reading? Would you get through some of it?
It's tough.
Yes.
The first bunch of letters were all like the same to me.
Oh, interesting.
Corinthians got more interesting, I thought,
Uh-huh.
and he was talking about in there, I would think some of the women have a hard time with part what it says in
You
Corinthians.
think?
Yeah, especially in Second Corinthians.
When you read in the context of,
Mhm.
you have to think about the context of when he was writing it at the time,
Absolutely.
and that's what that book talks about.
Yeah, yeah. So we're going to go ahead and start. Any questions before we start? Okay, so again, the format of the class is we're not actually going to take the time to read the Bible passages in class, but it's there for you if you want to just hold on to it and take one home if you need one. Okay, so we're going to start with the Gospel of Mark, the first of the four Gospels, written in 70 AD in Galilee, which is interesting, I think, given that so much of what we've already learned about was written in outlying cities and Greece and all over the place, but this is written in Galilee. I thought that was important. It's the first what we call narrative gospel. You're going to hear about the document called Q, and this is a little bit confusing, so bear with me. It's a hypothetical document, Q short for quell, a German word for search, or rather source, source. And it's a list of Jesus's teachings. And we think that it was around the same time as the writer Mark was writing. Mark did not use it, but assumed everyone had learned it. This is confusing, bear with me. Matthew and Luke used the document Q along with Mark to formulate their gospels, okay? This is something we can ask Professor Deirdre about. I think we can ask lots of questions. Just ask her, tell us about Q. What's the deal? It's such an important source document, and yet there's very little evidence of it, except in the Nag Hammadi documents found in Egypt. Do you remember in 1945 they found a giant clay jar under the dirt in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, and in it were, I think, seven actual books, codices, wrapped in gazelle leather of all things. And part of that had some information on Q. So it's a big old question, and I'm sorry to start off with that, but this was, again, oral learning that had been passed along to
What do you want? Sorry.
oral, in the oral tradition. Okay, so at any rate, Mark's was the first of the Gospels, and the teachings in Q were assumed to be common knowledge at the time, passed along in the oral tradition. Okay, it's the shortest of all the Gospels, only 16 chapters. It's the root of Matthew and Luke. You'll find when we get to Matthew and Luke, you'll find Mark almost word for word in there, along with a lot of Q, the teachings of Jesus. the shape of this gospel is threefold, which is different from fivefold in Matthew and Luke. It's Jesus in Galilee, his journey to Jerusalem, and his final week. What's interesting, well, I'll get to that. So just threefold, okay? All of this only took 1 year. So the Gospels of Mark, as well as Matthew and Luke, all three synoptic Gospels, meaning same, they're very much the same. All three of those only spanned 1 year, whereas John spanned about 3 or 4 years. Okay, you with me? A little bit of a confusing jump there at first with Q, but it's very mysterious, and maybe Professor Deirdre can shine some light on that.
I'm so intrigued with Q, I'm having trouble focusing.
Exactly. I wish we'd been starting right off the bat with it. Yeah. So, hello everybody. Hello Amy and Elaine. Here's what is not in this threefold shape. There's no birth story in Mark. There are lots of teachings. There are, I'm so sorry. Let me get my brain on right. There are not as many teachings because it was assumed they had heard them all through Q, meaning Jesus's teachings. There's no Lord's Prayer in Mark's Gospel. And there's no post-resurrection appearance story.
So how come Q isn't part of the Bible?
Good question. There's no written evidence of it except a little bit in Nag Hammadi. Yeah. A little background on these documents. From in the Old Testament, all of those documents were written on papyrus and scrolls. You know, they scrolled from right to left, right? And papyrus is very fragile, so they couldn't fold it. So they used scrolls instead, and they can only be so long, otherwise they start to break with use. The New Testament documents were almost all written on parchment made of skin, and that was able to be folded. It was called a codex. They could write it out and sew it and fold it, and that was called a codex in the shape of what we now call a book. So that's what these were all in codices, the plural for codex. Now there's a part of notice. Jesus never in Mark's gospel proclaims himself as Son of God or Lord, but Mark does. Jesus keeps it a secret, you'll notice. He'll say, tell no one. So you'll notice that when you read the gospel. Themes in the Gospel of Mark, you'll find these phrases a lot. The way, following the way. Remember the name of the community was not Christian until 4th century. That word was never used. They were called followers of the way. So Mark talks a lot about the way, and he talks a lot about the coming of the kingdom of God. So those are themes you'll find throughout. If you, as you read, they'll kind of pop out to you. Mark's Easter story is very brief, only 8 verses. Many more verses than all the other Gospels. Very brief. He's very succinct. It's a great economy of words. The ending of Mark is very puzzling. This is the one that has the women entering the tomb. And the angel says, you're looking for Jesus. He is not here. He is raised. But they run away frightened and tell no one. And that's the ending of Mark's gospel. And it's puzzled scholars for many, many years. And in some Bibles, people have even taken the liberty of writing alternate endings. Right?
Yeah.
But Mark's true gospel ends with the women running away in fear and telling no one. We don't use it much on Christmas Eve.
Yeah, right.
Rather, I'm sorry, on
Easter,
Easter,
yeah.
yeah. See, I just came from a diocesan Zoom meeting and it scrambled my brains, so please forgive me. I'm not quite on top of it just yet. All right, let's go a little bit further into Mark's gospel. All right. Very interesting. Do you all know anything about the year 70 AD? Does that pop out for any of you?
No.
Okay. Historically, it's a huge number. The year 70 AD is the year that the Jerusalem temple and the entire city of Jerusalem were destroyed. It was the 9/11 of Jerusalem in the year 70. And that's when this gospel was written, the wartime gospel. And I know our hearts are kind of tender right now with the war going on in the Middle East. And this is hard to think about, but you know, it's going on forever, I'm afraid. A little history about this war. Remember, this Jerusalem was a Jewish city under Roman Empire rule. Remember we talked about that context? And in the year 66, the Jewish people revolted and they had a brief victory. But before long, Rome came back and destroyed everything. And so Rome won. They called it the Little Apocalypse. It was like their 9/11. Of course, the big apocalypse was referring to Revelation. You'll hear in your reading, they talk about the desolating sacrilege, and that always puzzled me. So what are they talking about? What they're referring to is when Rome took over the temple before they destroyed it, they installed their own statues, their own idols, and they made sacrifices on the holy altar to Caesar. And that was considered the desolating sacrilege. Earlier in Mark's gospel, you'll hear Jesus prophesy this. He'll say, no stone will be unturned. And I don't know what he's talking about because the Jerusalem temple was massive. They've done recreations, restructurings of what it must have looked like. And I would like to know how they destroyed it because it was that massive. The stones were huge. So I wonder, what did they use?
Yeah.
Well, this kind of emphasized Mark's culture's feeling, just like in Paul, that the end of all time was near, that Jesus was coming imminently. So that's the context of Mark's gospel. Okay. Any questions or thoughts before we move on from Mark?
You say they destroyed the temple.
Yeah.
Temple was made of stone,
Right.
so they took all the stones away.
That's what I don't know. How do they destroy it?
They used to recycle all that stuff.
Mm.
All of it was recycled all the time,
Uh-huh.
for thousands of years.
Uh-huh. That makes sense.
You can just see in Greece where there are columns in the middle of walls that are this big,
Mhm.
as it's like they slice the columns like a lifesaver and put them in place.
Hmm.
You can see it all over Greece.
Makes sense. All the work that went into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question for Professor Deirdre. How did they destroy the temple? How did they destroy Jerusalem? I mean, I don't think bombs were a thing back then.
But even if it turned to rubble, kind of everything sort of, you know, the walls were down.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder with the Wailing Wall, why, if
Mhm.
that was one of the original walls,
That's a great question.
you know,
That's a
would
great
that be
question.
one of the, because
Right.
that's such a famous wall.
Yes, indeed. Has anyone here been to Israel? Really?
I went with David and Bill Trumbore
Oh gosh.
when we went on our trip from here,
Oh
and
gosh.
that was really fun. There's a picture in the history book here
Uh-huh.
of Good Shepherd. I
In
took that
Israel.
picture of him
Oh.
putting his prayer in the Wailing Wall.
How about you,
I've
Jean?
been there 11 times.
Oh,
What?
Well, for business.
Oh, I see.
Only once to Jerusalem. And it was the tourist version.
Yeah. My goodness,
Yeah.
I would love to
The
go.
wildest is going to the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, where the olive trees were probably as old as Jesus, because olive
Yes.
trees live forever. It was
Yeah.
beautiful.
That's really.
But the funniest was our guide, who was, I think, Palestinian.
Uh-huh.
And we were up on the top of the hill looking down at Jerusalem,
Mhm.
and he pointed to a rock, and it had this impression that looked like it could be a footprint.
Uh-huh.
That's where Jesus ascended into heaven.
Oh my
Of
goodness.
course, we're all cracking up. Stories get made up.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Apparently, back in that time, the Romans would make an imprint of a foot to give a sign, a directional sign. I don't know enough about it, but
Well,
I
it
guess-
didn't really look like foot, but
Oh, I
it
see.
sort of resembled a foot. You know,
Uh-huh.
like how rocks have different places
Little
to catch water and,
indentations, yeah.
yeah.
I think there's an easier way than that.
Right.
Exactly, a rock that chip into a rock.
Right.
Footprint and rock.
All right, so take a look at Mark when you get home and read through in this context. Think of it as a wartime gospel. We're going to move on to James. Mark was written in 70. James was written in year 75. And this was a letter written to Christian Jews in the diaspora, meaning the spread out Jews who weren't killed and who had left Jerusalem. They were now in the diaspora, far reaches of the land. Now, some people originally thought this was James, Jesus's brother, but scholarship now feels it was not his brother, another disciple named James.
Did he have a younger brother, James?
I don't know if he was younger or older. I
yeah.
don't know.
And because
assuming-
Mary, I think, was supposedly a virgin.
That's right.
So there
Yes,
would
I'm
be
assuming,
not
unless
been
it
any
was
kids.
Joseph's.
Right, it was
son,
just,
yeah.
yeah.
This is not a theological letter. It's very practical and emphasizes the doing of things. And this is where in his letter, we hear the words, faith without works is dead. We've heard that, right? Great mission statement, but very controversial. And I'll get to that. It's very compassionate for the poor. It's about wisdom and living the way, again, just like Mark talks about the way. It's about loyalty to God, not to the world. And you'll find in this letter a very harsh indictment of the rich. And partly for that reason, and partly for the emphasis on works versus faith and grace, it's been controversial. Remember in Paul's letter, he talked about faith and grace being more important than works. James has taken the opposite approach. It says it's what you do about it. And I know especially those of us who are engaged in mission work, we know that doing really matters. Prayers are wonderful, but acts are important too, right? So James has gotten a little bit of friction around that. But in this letter, you'll find more of Jesus's teachings than in any of the other letters other than the Gospels. So it's a very faithful follower, but had his own take on how we are to live. Colossians, written in 80, to the Christian communities in Colossia and Laodicea. This is one that people think Paul wrote, but he did not. It was an imitator of Paul. We don't know who, but he imitated Paul's shape of the letter very faithfully, and almost looks like a forgery towards the end. Paul never founded this community and never visited the community. It doesn't mean he could have written to them, but he was gone at this time. He had already been executed.
So he must have been a follower, whoever wrote it, must have been a follower of Paul to know his style.
Very much
Right.
so.
Yeah.
Must have seen the
Must
letter
have seen the letter.
Yeah.
Right.
in other communities, yeah. A very telling difference the household codes are almost opposite in this letter versus Paul's letter. We'll wait till March comes. That's okay. Remember in Paul's letter, he talked about how all are equal. There are no, that hierarchies have been abolished. Remember, slave and free, male and women. Remember, in this letter, it says that wives must be subordinate to their husbands.
Ooh.
Well, Paul
Right.
said that too in
Corinthians.
Corinthians.
He did?
He
He
did.
was talking about, women, yes.
He said,
women,
men obey God, women obey
Obey men.
your husbands.
And about having your hair covered.
Right,
and-
right.
And you can't speak in church.
Right,
They're equal. Pigs are equal. It's like the founders thought all men were equal.
right.
Second Corinthians.
That's 2 Corinthians, and Paul didn't write that.
Oh, you did.
No,
No,
that was first Corinthians.
no. Well, if you already read it,
Yeah, it was like 11 or 12.
I don't remember which one. it
Yeah,
was.
I
But
just read
so
it.
Paul did not write each of them.
he only wrote 7 of them. Yeah, you would have read 2 Corinthians, but Paul did not write that one. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry. Alrighty. So this writer does talk about the cosmic Christ, much like John does when we get to John, very incarnational. And warns to be careful of other teachers, which is interesting because this writer is acting sort of like a teacher. The closing sounds just like Paul, and it makes it really sound like a forgery. So that's one for Professor Deirdre. Moving on to the Gospel of Matthew, if you're ready. Okay. This was written in the late 80s. We like to think that it was written by Matthew himself, Levi the tax collector, but it was not.
Well, if he lived with, well, he'd be too old.
Yeah. He just like Luke, Matthew and Luke both used Mark and Q in their writing, but they added two levels, making it a 5-fold narrative. Added birth stories and named Jesus as Emmanuel, which will come into play later, and has more of Jesus's teachings in it than Mark's gospel does. Very deep roots in Judaism, parallels Jesus as the new Moses, and the whole narrative echoes the Exodus. And that's the 5-fold narrative I mentioned, where it starts with birth story and genealogy. Then 2 to 4 sections are Jesus in Galilee, in Jerusalem, and the final week, just like in Mark, but then adds the post-resurrection appearances. And Luke does the same 5-fold narrative shape.
So where did the birth story come from?
Oral tradition.
Or
Oral tradition, yeah. Some say that Mark's gospel was written during a time when it was common knowledge, the story of Jesus. So he didn't take the time to write it out. We don't know. Yeah.
Hearsay.
Well, don't know, but there's lots of other sources of information other than the Bible. So the themes you'll find as you read through Matthew's gospel, you'll hear mountains mentioned a lot. Up on the mountain, they went to the mountain, it happened on the mountain. As a clue that that's Matthew's gospel, if they're talking about mountains. It'll be on a test if you're ever in seminary.
Oh, mountains. Which gospel?
You'll see it is written a lot referring to the Torah. He refers to the Old Testament 40 times. Yeah. And in Matthew's gospel, he restricts Jesus's mission to Jews only, whereas It's only after the resurrection that Jesus says, go to all nations, all nations. Here's an interesting thing. Matthew's gospel is super hostile to non-Christian Jews. It's Jews versus Christian Jews. Okay. And it's given scriptural justification for anti-Semitism and Jewish persecution. We'll get to that. A great indictment of the leaders of the time, the scribes and Pharisees. The phrase brood of vipers is Jesus talking about the scribes and Pharisees.
And
Matthew,
he's talking about them in a negative way,
yes,
very negative.
very, very, very hostile, yes.
And they were Jewish?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Is that why, I mean, you know, over history, Jews have been hated, so.
We're gonna get to that,
Interesting.
yeah. A lot of scriptural foundation in this gospel, also in John's, unfortunately. The temple destruction in the year 70 that we talked about, Matthew's interpretation is that that's God's judgment of the Jews who rejected Jesus. Oof. Towards the end, the writer Matthew assigns Jesus' death to the Jewish people. Look up, if you would, Matthew chapter 27. Actually, I can look for you. Let's quickly. Towards the end. I'll do it for you. Matthew 27, verse 24.
Nine, nine, seven?
9:07.
No, that's.
And the books are differently numbered.
It's the only one,
That's right.
and that's because that's one John had last week.
Oh,
This one is, no, one of them has on the bottom,
Mine is-
Jared. One has something that is something different along the bottom. This says, it should say the New Standard Version, but I saw one, oh, here it is, this one with apocryphal.
okay.
This one should be kept away.
Okay.
That one's the only difference.
Gotcha. Okay. So at this point in Matthew's gospel, we're in the midst of Jesus being condemned to be crucified. I'll read it for you. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. Then the people as a whole, meaning the Jews, the people as a whole answered, his blood be on us and on our children. And that has since then been called the blood curse, which has led to Jewish persecution, that it was the Jews' fault. That's kind of
So
the
they
big.
blame that for Jesus.
Yeah. So the question of all this hostility, why would there be such condemnation of the Jews? After the temple destruction, hostility towards the Jews increased. And many of the Jews, like I mentioned, were killed in the war. The ones left were very protective of their Jewish identity. And Gentile Christians were more predominant since the Jewish fighters had been killed or run off into the diaspora. But at this point, mostly Gentile Christians were leading the churches. And since no circumcision or kosher food laws were observed anymore, that break grew. And this began what they called the parting of the ways, the great separation between Christians and Jews.
But then there's a group in there now, Jews for Jesus.
Been around for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So makes you wonder.
Yeah. You with me?
So,
So
Yeah,
far.
so far.
Good, okay. All right, a little bit more about Matthew. Jews began to persecute Christian Jews. You with me? The Jews were persecuting the Christian Jews. But it was a pretty mild persecution. The only two deaths we know about were the martyrdom of Stephen and James, who we just read about. These Christian Jews who had grown up in synagogue, grown up in community, were now ostracized and thrown out of their community. So it was quite a price to pay to be a Christian Jew. At the ending of Matthew's gospel, we have our first appearance story, and this fulfills the promise of Mark's angel who said, "He is not here, he is raised." It happens on a mountain, of course, and this is where the Great Commission is given, where Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." And this was, of course, the basis of all missionary work. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. But unfortunately, the word nations didn't mean then what we've taken it to mean now. The word nation meant Gentile. So go therefore to all Gentiles and make disciples of all Gentiles. So the risen Christ gives the mission to non-Jews. How about that? With me? Hello up there, you guys okay?
Yeah, hello, I'm here.
Okay. Moving on to Hebrews. The author of Hebrews is unknown. It was written in between 70 and 90, and it was written to second generation Christian Jews. So the ones who have been persecuted, they're the ones being written to in Hebrews.
how do we know that?
The dating of the manuscript, and the body of the letter talks about the suffering and persecution of this group now. It emphasizes Jesus' suffering and humanity as well, but also emphasizes the cosmic Christ. Gives past practical counsel to the community under pressure, encouraging them to persevere and endure what they're going through. And talks about this beautiful phrase that we probably all love, that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. Beautiful writing in this letter, just beautiful. I wish we knew who wrote it. Good for Deirdre. And that's as far as it goes. How about that? Yeah. So that's what I have for you today. A little bit to chew on, a lot to ponder, given the persecution that then took off, right? Persecution of Christians. The parting of the ways between Jews and Christians, the root of anti-Semitism. There's a lot to think about when you read this week. Any thoughts or questions I can try to answer?
So from my reading last week, Paul felt that he had been called to minister to non-Christian Jews.
Mm-hmm.
To the
No,
Gentile,
non-Jewish Christian,
yeah,
Gentiles.
I'm sorry, yes.
That's okay.
So this is like going against these, what am I trying to say here? This is like almost, now they're persecuting those people that Paul was preaching to and writing his letters to.
No, they're persecuting the Jewish Christians.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right, all right.
The ones who started as Jews and
Mhm.
became Christians.
Okay. So the Gentile Christians are okay, all right.
I'm not sure
Right.
I follow what you just said.
Well, you said that they're persecuting the Jewish Christians. So if you were Jewish
Yes.
and became Christian,
They're
or if
gonna-
you were Gentile and became Christian, they were going after the ones that had originally been Jewish.
Exactly. Yeah.
But why? If they switched to
Well,
Christianity?
because because there was such an emphasis now on no need for circumcision or kosher food.
Oh,
They're going against the law.
Mhm, right, right.
even though that's switched around, I mean, it seems like, doesn't matter what you are. Whether people choose circumcision or not, it's not necessary, I mean, Jews, obviously,
Well, nowadays.
yeah, nowadays, I know,
Nowadays,
it's
right,
just like,
But Paul said that, he said that the faith was more important than the law.
right,
That's right, that's right. Faith over law and grace over works. Right,
yeah.
good memory. Good job.
I'll forget it by tomorrow.
Oh, me too, I've forgotten everything.
Two big differences. One group thinking that even if you were Jewish and became Christian,
It didn't matter,
it didn't matter. And the other person said, no way, once a Jew, always a Jew.
wow,
And they still believe that.
I think you're right. You know, we all feel we have real fealty to what we believe and about, we have real fealty to Jesus, and they have real fealty to the Messiah that is yet to come. And that's, we're all allowed to believe what we believe, and that's okay. We all believe in the one same God. We just have different paths of the same.
even Muslims,
Yes,
same God,
we're all Abrahamic. The Muslims, Jews, and Christians. That's why the Holy Land is so charged, because it's I love this word, the umphalos, which means belly button of the world.
what is it? Oop,
Umphalos.
Oompa, that's like the Oompa Loompas. In Harry,
The belly button of the world, the beginning of the world for the three great faiths.
right,
It's holy to all three.
well, now Jerusalem, the middle of it is the mosque, in the
Well,
middle of the city,
That's
the big
Holy Land,
mosque.
that's the umphalos.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's where Muhammad
right,
ascended.
and that's right in the middle of the whole city, that you go see
Yeah,
when you're there, take
So
your
it's-
shoes off and go in,
yeah, it's just such charged emotion,
yeah,
So our prayers for peace in the Middle East have been going on forever,
right. Well, until people decide to agree to disagree,
Yeah,
it's not gonna end.
simple as that.
It is, I mean, think about it, people just let people be who they want to be.
That'll never happen, never.
I don't think
Never
it will,
happened.
I don't, and
Because
now
we're-
we're erasing history, in this country even.
And I'm over there.
Oh, that's my picture, I took it
Okay,
I used to ask the guy from the other guy,
from the wall.
why, does all this go on between,
mhm,
and he said, well, the Arab nations are made up of a lot of tribes.
mhm, mhm,
And the same is true in Palestine.
mhm.
And when people run for office in Palestine, Hamas is not the majority. It's nowhere near the majority,
Right,
but it gets the plurality needed to win because there's so many people that run for office.
I see, it dilutes it.
So it's not the majority over there. I'm sure there are a lot of Palestinians that are very upset. with
Absolutely.
What's happened.
Oh, I'm sure the majority
Mhm.
are running horrified, just like the Israelis.
And the other thing is that I kind of interesting is that there are a lot of Arabs that live in Israel
Mhm,
that are quite happy.
mhm,
And I'm sure a lot of it has to do with economics and, they have to make a decent living.
right,
You look at Gaza and I don't know how people make a living. You got 2 million people in an area that's the size of Washington DC.
So,
Right?
and Gaza has been a bone of contention for forever.
A lot of it comes down to, it's not really religion, it comes down to economics. And
Exactly,
Being able to make a decent living.
right, the quality of soil there, the access to the water there, Well, I'm gonna check the time. Good, we're done a little bit early. We will go on forward from here next week. And hopefully all the slides will come through for everyone.